Hey class, sorry I can't be with you today, but I'm going to do a quick overview of the topic that we were going to cover. I'm going to use the class notes, the lecture notes that you have handy, and you can follow along here or you can pull up your own notes. Let me share the notes. All right, guys, sorry for that little delay, but there's always technology issues when I use this. All right, so we're going to continue talking about um, economic growth. And we talked about the market for labor, the supply and demand for labor, and how that impacts the productivity function. The amount of labor from the labor and supply model gives us our full employment level, which tells us how much our GDP should be at potential GDP. Okay, so today we're going to talk about defining and calculating economic growth rate and explaining the implications of sustained growth. Just like anything else in economics, we want to make sure we know what we're measuring. And we also want to make sure that we know what we are counting. So economic growth. Economic growth, we talked about, is the sustained expansion of production possibilities as measured by the increase in real GDP over a given period. So we're talking about potential GDP increasing. The economic growth rate is the annual percentage rate of change in real GDP. Tells us how rapidly the economy is changing. And we already know how to calculate growth, don't we? We use our formula. New minus initial divided by initial times 100 equals growth rate. And you can use this formula for anything. But we're going to convert it to be able to use it with GDP. So we'll replace these amounts with GDP. So real GDP new minus real GDP initial divided by real GDP initial times 100 equals growth in real GDP. Okay. Now, that's good. That's helpful. But remember that we like to measure the growth in an economy's wealth by the standard of living. In other words, we like to use real GDP person or real GDP per capita to measure growth. Because remember, real GDP per capita tells us how much real GDP grew divided by the population. Okay? And what we want to see grow is the real GDP per capita. That means that the economy is is growing. So if population stays the same, but real GDP goes up, the numerator, the outcome is a positive amount, right? The number became bigger because real GDP grew bigger. But if real GDP stays the same and population grows bigger, sorry, I didn't make that an arrow. Then the outcome is negative because now we're increasing the numerator or the denominator, sorry. When the denominator gets bigger, this ratio gets smaller and we're actually contracting. But if both change, so let's say we have plus and plus, we don't know because we don't know how much real GDP changed in relation to how much the population changed. What we do know is this: if as long as real GDP grows faster than population, then we're going to have a positive number and an increase and a positive growth rate. Okay. All right. So let's talk about how we calculate it. Well, we said real GDP growth rate is real GDP current year minus initial divided by initial times 100. But we were after real GDP per capita growth rate. And that is real GDP per capita current minus real GDP per capita initial minus real GDP divided by real GDP per capita initial times 100. That's an awful lot to calculate. So we're going to take an easier approach to this. We're not going to use this way. We're going to use what's called the subtraction method. This goes back to understanding the ratio. As long as real GDP, the numerator, grows faster than the population grows rate, then we have positive growth. So if we subtract the two, we'll get our growth rate. Now, the second part of growth is what we call the magic of sustained growth. The magic of sustained growth has to do with something called compounding. Okay, let's take an example. If I put $100 in the bank today and I earn 1% interest a year, at the end of year one, I'll have earned $1, which means my balance will be $101. Now, how much will I earn on interest in year two? Well, now we multiply that 1% times 101, which equals, sorry, I got to make sure I get this right. $101 times 1.01. Sorry, 101 times 1.01 means we actually earn $1.01 in interest. So our new balance is $2.01. We call this the compounding effect. And that means that as we start, as we put an initial deposit in the bank, we earn interest in the first period, and then we earn interest on the new balance in the second period, and it continues to grow. So if you put $100 in the bank, your money is going to continue to grow, even if you don't put any more money in the bank. What would be nice if we put a little bit of money in the bank and we earn the interest, it would compound. Sustained growth means that we want to know how quickly our economy is growing because we want that compound effect. And if we know how much our economy is growing, we can predict how much our economy will grow to, or when it will double in size. The rule of 70 says if we divide 70 by 2%, we get 35 years, which means it will take 35 years for the population, or excuse me, the economy to double. That's important to know. And what we like in economics is we like to have slow, sustained growth rather than big spikes of growth. Okay, we like to have sustained slow growth because that gives us a steady upward path in real GDP and potential GDP. It means we can sustain our growth over a long period of time and keep growing. Let's do an example. Okay, we're going to say China has a GDP, a real GDP of 89.28 trillion yuan in 2018 and 91.31 trillion yuan in 2020, 1,400 million population in 2019 and 1,404 in 2020. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to calculate the growth rate of each. And there's the math, you can look at it, but we have a growth rate in terms of real GDP of 2.27% and a growth rate in population of 0.29%. Now, if we use the subtraction method and we subtract the 0.29 from the 2.27, we get a growth rate in real GDP per capita of 1.98%. And if we take that 1.98% and divide it into 70, that means that the economy will double in 35.35 years, assuming that the growth rate stays the same. Okay, very simple. Now, let's move on to talking about labor. Remember that we said that when we look at the economy at a single point in time, we're foregoing the ability to add capital, land, and entrepreneurship. The only thing that really changes is labor in the short run. It can change quickly. So if we want to focus on labor as our means of growing the economy, let's look at what we can do. Well, we have to increase labor or the labor hours to grow the economy. So we can do one of two things. We can throw more bodies at the problem. We increase the quantity of labor. In other words, increase it from 250 billion to 350 billion hours per year. Or we can increase the productivity. We can increase the productivity of the existing workers we have. We're going to talk about that one second. If we have higher labor, okay, that would look like this. Here's our labor demand and supply curve. If we were able to increase the quantity of labor in our economy, that would cause the demand curve to shift to the right. That might mean making people work longer. Excuse me. That might mean increasing the working age population. It might mean increasing the labor force participation rate. So all the ways that you can do those things would increase the amount of aggregate hours. So we're going to take this 350 and we are going to drag it down to our production function. Remember, the production function shows us our potential GDP when we utilize our labor resources to the maximum. And it turns out that what happens here is we move from point A to point C when we go from 250 to 350 on the production function, which gives us an increase in production of about $4 trillion in real GDP. Now that's good, but there's a couple of downsides to that. Okay, we got what we wanted, which is an increase in production. But let's look at how we did that. If you look back here at the supply curve, you'll notice that when we increase labor supply, we decrease the wage rate. Okay, when we increase supply, the price goes down. In this case, it's the wage rate. So number one, we've decreased the wage rate for the economy, which is probably not helpful to the workers in the economy. And number two, remember that this production function slacks off. It flattens out at the end because diminishing returns from labor. We can only add so much labor before we run out of positive returns. Think of the factory getting too full. And so we can keep adding labor, but we're going to get smaller and smaller returns. And eventually we're going to get no return on adding more labor. So there's a limit to how much labor we can add to get an increased output because of diminishing returns. And it turns out that labor growth increases real GDP, but to grow the economy, potential GDP must increase. Therefore, we have to become more productive. Let's talk about what that means. Labor productivity is the amount of output over the amount of input in terms of labor hours. And if we keep the labor hours the same, but we increase the output, we're going to get higher productivity, which means higher potential GDP. Okay, we're permanently increasing our economy's ability to produce more. And there's three ways to increase labor productivity. I'm going to skip to the next page. Physical capital growth, in other words, we can come up with new capital through savings and investment that increases the capital dollars per worker, which increases productivity. However, that also suffers from the law of diminishing returns. Okay? Human capital. Human capital is the increase in human labor's experience, training, and the ability to produce more with less. Okay? So if I can take 100 workers and make them produce twice as much as they could before by simply training them and finding experienced workers to substitute for the less experienced workers, then I am increasing human capital, which is going to increase my ability to produce, which is going to increase potential GDP without changing labor. Okay? The third way is technological advances. Technological advances come along in time. Think of the cotton gin, came about during I believe, right around the time of the Civil War. And the cotton gin enabled cotton producers to produce more cotton with the same labor resources. Okay, it made them more productive. Okay, and you could think about machines today that make workers more productive. Certainly a automatic checkout scanner makes the checkout process more productive for the checkout person, right? All he or she has to do is scan the product over the scanner and not have to manually enter the price for each good into the cash register. And I'm sure you could come up with dozens of advances in terms of technology. Okay, let's look at how increase in productivity affects the economy. So we'll start at the top with the production function for this time. When we get an increase in our potential GDP, we get a permanent increase in the ability to produce with the same resources. The production function is going to shift up, and we're going to go from point A to point B, which gives us a nice bump in output right away. But here's the kicker. At the same time, this increase in productivity will increase the demand for labor because more productive workers are more in demand. So firms are going to seek to hire more labor, a little bit more labor anyway. And we're going to increase labor hours from 250 to 300. And that 250 to 300 is going to shift us along that new production frontier curve a little bit to give us even higher output. So A to B to C is the path. And that's why this is better than just throwing labor at the problem. Because remember, labor, increasing just the quantity of labor, we move along this production function, and eventually we're going to run out of places to grow. But if we keep shifting production function up, we can have unlimited growth. All right. Now, let's talk about theories of economic growth. Okay. I'm just going to talk about two of them. There were a couple more that came along, but the initial theory of growth, the classical growth theory, was that growth was tied to the population. In other words, we were back at the first instance where adding more labor increased production. Sorry, not productivity. And that was probably true back in the 16 and 1700s when most work was manual intensive. And there was certainly an unlimited number of workers at that time to add because the economy was a little bit smaller than it is today. But it turns out that this is not true. And we can look at one case to explain that. Who has the largest population on the planet? It's either China or India. I don't remember which. But either case, neither of those countries has a real GDP that's higher than some of the top countries in the world. The United States, for example. And we already looked at the real GDP per capita for China, and it's not even close to the real GDP per capita of the US or of Luxembourg or Monaco or Singapore or some of those other countries in the top 10. So it turns out that population has no relationship with gross domestic product growth. But here is what does in today's modern world lead to growth. We're going to start right here with the idea that humans always are facing scarcity and always trying to achieve a higher standard of living. So we always want to better our lives in some way, shape, or form. And you can just imagine the inventions from the automobile to the stove to GPS technology that have improved our lives over time. Well, our constant desire to improve our standard of living is what creates incentives for entrepreneurs to innovate new products to meet those needs, right? So the more that we want, the higher standard of living we want, the more we have incentive for entrepreneurs to innovate and make a profit from creating those new goods and services, and bettering themselves. And at the same time, they're creating new and better jobs for the economy. And they're also creating more time for us to do other things with our time, not just leisure, right? Think about how much of one of the things that got women back into the workforce, as we looked at in the unemployment section, that was a trend, women coming back to work, was the fact that they had modern conveniences at home that they didn't have to necessarily spend as much time cooking and cleaning and taking care of kids and doing other things that somebody who runs a house would have to do. And once we achieve that new plateau of a higher standard of living, it starts all over again. We want to grow more. We want to get even higher standard of living, and the cycle starts all over again. So we call this a perpetual motion machine, perpetual economic growth. As long as our standards of living keep rising and we want to improve upon those standards of living, we're going to create the incentives to create new products, which grow the economy, which create a higher standard of living and start all over again. Okay? Last section here is if we agree that sustained growth is important to our economy as a whole to keep it strong and healthy, then we as a society need to look at things that we need to do to maintain that growth. Because in other words, it's not just about the entrepreneurs having an idea. We need to create the incentives or the conditions for the ability for entrepreneurs to achieve higher production, to use a higher productive or more productive workforce to gain those growths. And the precondition for economic growth is having economic freedom, having property rights, and having free markets in an economy. Without those three things, very little would get invented, quite honestly. If households were not able to profit on their new ideas and their new products, then there would be no incentive to work to invent those products. I mean, they might care about mankind being better off, but they still have to make a paycheck and feed their family. And, it's going to be hard to be drawn away from that if their new idea doesn't come it comes at the expense of sacrificing their family or some other reason. Okay, so preconditions for economic growth are economic freedom, property rights, and economic and free markets. Okay. So we need to think about things that help incent economic growth by improving human capital, the technological advances, and capital improvements for businesses. And the government can play a role in this by using subsidies and grants and tax money to create opportunities to, for example, improve the quality of education. You know, the fact that we have a K through 12 system, everybody has to go K through 12, means that we have an education level in our economy that is better than other countries. Okay. We also have a higher degree of four-year graduates, four-year college graduates than other countries. And the list goes on. Okay. So as we get into later chapters and we talk about economic policy, don't forget that the government plays a role in establishing policies that can achieve faster growth. Okay. And there's a little statement at the end about why some nations are rich and others are poor. And it has all to do with the preconditions I mentioned and the fact that they can't break out of that poverty cycle because they don't have the ability to switch from more productive technology from labor. Okay, if there's any questions, I can address them in the next class. You have assigned to you two class exercises. They're both very short. They're about 10 or 12 questions each. If you go into the class exercises folder and look at class exercises module 6.1 and 6.2, complete those before the next class, you should be all caught up. Thank you, and I appreciate your time.